The floor was marble, slick and unfeeling beneath my feet, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if I might slip, not because my shoes were worn or because my bones were old, but because the weight of what I was carrying trembled inside me like a living thing. My fingers tightened around the frayed strap of my handbag. It had been my husband's gift to me on our 25th anniversary, scuffed now, faded at the edges, much like me, but still holding on. The air in the courtroom was sharp, like it had teeth. It bit at my skin, and I shivered, though I refused to let it show. All around me, people turned to look. Their heads tilted as though I were some curious relic that had wandered into their polished world of power suits and shiny shoes. I caught the faint curl of a smirk from one young man as I passed, his pen tapping against his clipboard in lazy rhythm. He couldn't have been older than 25, and I wondered if he had a mother who loved him, if she still waited up at night to hear his key turn in the door. They didn't know who I was. And that suited me just fine. The benches creaked beneath the weight of bodies shifting, murmuring. I could hear the whispers rise like a tide. Who is she? Why is she here? Someone even chuckled, low and disbelieving, like my presence alone was a joke. I felt their eyes trying to strip me bare, to peel away my dignity as though it were something they could simply take. I took each step carefully, deliberately, my cane tapping like a heartbeat against the floor. 1, 2, 3, slow and steady, like I was counting down to something. I had dressed simply. A charcoal gray dress that reached my ankles, the same one I wore to my husband's funeral 14 years ago. It smelled faintly of cedar from the old wardrobe where it had slept all these years, and as I smoothed it over my hips, I remembered his hands doing the same. He'd always said gray made my eyes look like storm clouds. Today, I hoped they did. I lowered myself onto the hard wooden bench and folded my hands in my lap. The gavel hadn't even fallen yet, and still the courtroom was alive with energy, like a living creature twitching in its sleep. Lawyers clustered in suits, heads bent close as they whispered strategy. Papers rustled like restless leaves. A woman at the far end of the room snapped her gum, the sound sharp as a slap. And above it all, the laughter lingered. It was faint, restrained. No one dared laugh outright in a courtroom, but I could feel it. Like static, prickling the hairs on my neck. They were laughing at me, though they didn't dare let it fully escape their polished teeth. It wasn't the first time I'd been laughed at. But it might be the last. My eyes drifted toward the front, where the opposing counsel was setting out folders in meticulous rows. I caught a glimpse of the nameplate, Mr. J. Morgan. A name that once belonged to the boy who used to lie across our old kitchen table, scribbling homework while I stirred lentils on the stove. A boy who once begged me to let him stay up past midnight just to watch the stars from the roof. But they didn't know that. Not yet. He hadn't arrived yet. My son. Their lawyer. Their champion. My heart thudded against my ribs, each beat echoing through the hollow spaces where my pride used to live. It had taken everything, every ounce of patience, every scrap of faith I had left, to walk into this room and face the child who had become my enemy. A bailiff cleared his throat. The room shifted, voices dimming, and a hush settled over the space like dust falling from the rafters. My breath caught. This was it. This was the moment I had imagined on sleepless nights in rented rooms, when loneliness pressed against me like a second skin. I had dreamed of this moment not with joy, but with a kind of grim inevitability, as though I were a storm cloud that had wandered too far from the sea and could no longer hold back the rain. And still, as I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, I was shaking. I hated that. Hated how the tremor in my fingers betrayed me, how it made me look small when I needed to be enormous. I pressed them flat against the bench, felt the grooves in the old wood dig into my palms. I imagined they were roots, anchoring me to the earth. I remembered the first time I ever entered a courthouse. I was 23, holding my newborn son in my arms as I signed the papers declaring him mine alone. His father had been buried 3 days earlier, the ink on his death certificate barely dry. The clerk had offered me a sad smile, and I had smiled back, cradling my entire world in a hospital blanket. And now here I was, half a century later, ready to face that same boy as though he were a stranger. The door creaked open. I turned my head, and the world seemed to hold its breath. There he was. Tall. Straight-backed. Immaculate in a navy suit that cost more than I once made in a year. His hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place. His jaw was set, sharp as broken glass. And his eyes. His eyes slid over me like I was invisible. No flicker of recognition. Not even the faintest spark of the boy I raised. He walked past me without a pause, without a word, without so much as the ghost of a smile, and for a moment, I felt my heart stumble in my chest. I had imagined this moment for years, and somehow I'd still been foolish enough to think there might be something. A nod. A glance. A hesitation. There was nothing. He took his place at the front, arranging his papers with mechanical precision. The others greeted him with warm handshakes, clasped shoulders, laughter. He laughed too, low and easy, and the sound cut through me like a blade. I pressed my lips together until I could taste the faint iron tang of blood. I would not cry. Not here. Not yet. The judge entered, robes sweeping, gavel cracking through the air like thunder. Everyone rose, and so did I, slowly, carefully, my knees trembling. I thought of all the nights I had lain awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would survive long enough to see this day. I had. The judge began to speak, words rolling over me like a tide I couldn't quite hear. My heartbeat was louder, drowning out everything else. Across the room, my son sat, pen poised, lips pursed. He was the image of control. And I was the image of everything he had thrown away. They still didn't know who I was. Not yet. Let them laugh. Let them whisper. Let them see only a frail old woman clutching her faded handbag as though it were a lifeline. They had no idea that the storm had already begun. Because when my turn came to speak, I would not address the judge first. I would look straight at their star lawyer, straight into the eyes that used to look at me with love, and I would say the word that would silence the whole room. Son. There are days when I can't quite remember what I had for breakfast, or where I left my glasses, or even the names of old neighbors who used to bring me roses from their garden. But I remember my son's first cry with a clarity that still startles me. It tore through the silence of the hospital room like sunlight through fog, sharp, bright, undeniable. The nurse placed him in my trembling arms, and I remember thinking he was the most fragile thing I had ever held. So small. So impossibly perfect. I named him Jonathan, after his father. John never got to meet his namesake. My husband was gone before our boy took his first breath, snatched from us by a heart attack that arrived like a thief in the night. One moment he was laughing with me in our kitchen, his hands dusted with flour, promising we would name our baby after a star. The next, he was on the floor, eyes wide, lips turning the color of bruised violets. I screamed until my throat bled, but nothing brought him back. I was 23 and widowed, cradling a baby who had his father's eyes. The years that followed were a blur of exhaustion and small victories. I worked at the library by day, shelving books until my back ached, and stitched clothes by the yellow glow of a single lamp at night. There were weeks when dinner was nothing more than plain bread dipped in tea, when I gave him my portion and lied that I had already eaten. But he never noticed, children rarely do. He just looked up at me with those wide eyes, trusting that the world would be kind because I was kind. And I was. To him, I was everything. He would sit at our rickety kitchen table, swinging his legs and asking endless questions about everything. Why the sky changed colors at sunset. Why people cried when they were happy. Why birds never seemed to get lost. I answered each one like it was the most important question in the world, because to him, it was. He was brilliant from the start. By the time he was 6, he was reading books meant for teenagers, his tiny finger tracing each word like he was unlocking a secret. The teachers said he had a remarkable mind, and I suppose he did. But what I remember most was not his cleverness, it was his laughter. Light and free, like bells caught in the wind. That laughter used to fill every corner of our little house. And then, slowly, it didn't. It started when he was 12, and the world began to notice him the way I always had. He won a citywide essay contest, and newspapers called him the boy genius. Scholarships followed, and then internships, and suddenly he was surrounded by people who saw him not as my little boy, but as something rare and valuable, like a gemstone. I tried to keep up. I really did. I wore my nicest dress to every school event, even when it was patched at the seams. I clapped the loudest at every awards ceremony, even when my hands were raw from sewing all night. But somewhere between those flashing cameras and congratulatory handshakes, he began to look at me differently, like I belonged to a world he had already outgrown. By 17, he was barely coming home. He lived in dorms, then apartments, then places I only knew about from return addresses on unopened Christmas cards. He stopped calling me Mama. He started calling me Mother, and then stopped calling at all. The first time I heard about him in the news, he was 23, the same age I had been when I held him for the first time. The article called him a legal prodigy, said he'd graduated early, been recruited by one of the top firms in the country. There was a photograph of him shaking hands with some politician, his smile dazzling, his eyes cold. I cut that article out and tucked it into my Bible, next to his baby picture. I don't know why. Maybe I hoped that if the two stayed pressed together long enough, the man he had become might soften and remember the boy he once was. But he didn't. Years passed, and the distance between us grew like ivy, creeping silently until it covered everything. I sent him letters on his birthdays, careful not to sound like I was asking for anything. Sometimes I told him stories from his childhood, the time he painted our dog blue, the way he used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I thought maybe it would remind him of where he came from. He never wrote back. Then, one winter afternoon, I saw him again, on television this time. He was standing behind a podium in a crisp navy suit, announcing the launch of his own law firm. He spoke with such precision, such confidence, that the crowd applauded every word. But what caught me wasn't his success. It was his smile. It didn't reach his eyes. And in that moment, sitting alone in my tiny rented room with the radiator rattling like bones, I felt something I had never felt toward my own child. Fear. Because I realized that the world hadn't just taken him from me. It had swallowed him whole. It didn't happen all at once, the breaking. It was gradual, like ice thawing. Small things at first. He didn't answer my calls. He stopped visiting entirely. When his father's old workshop needed repairs, he sent strangers with clipboards instead of coming himself. I tried to tell myself he was just busy, that this was what success looked like. But deep down, I knew better. He wasn't just too busy to come home. He didn't want to. The last real conversation we had was over the phone, nearly a decade ago. I had called to tell him that the old peach tree in our yard had finally died. He was silent for a long time, and then he said, "Cut it down. It's useless now." Then he hung up. And I stood there, staring at the dead tree, thinking about how he used to sit beneath it for hours as a boy, reading until the fireflies came out. He once told me he thought the tree was magic because it gave him fruit and shade and secrets to whisper to. But to him now, it was just wood. Just something to be removed when it no longer served a purpose. That was the moment I understood. I had lost my boy. Not to death, not to illness, but to ambition. He had become a man who measured worth in profit and time, who saw the world not in colors and stories, but in contracts and numbers. And somewhere in that transformation, he had erased me, not maliciously, not even deliberately. Just, efficiently. As though I were an old file to be archived, forgotten, or destroyed. I don't know what finally broke inside me, but one day, I stopped sending letters. I stopped calling. I stopped hoping. I packed away his childhood things, his wooden blocks, his science fair medals, the threadbare teddy bear missing an ear, and tucked them into the attic like a wound I couldn't keep looking at. For a long time, I lived as though he were gone. Until the day I received the letter. It came in a thick white envelope, embossed with the seal of his firm. My name was typed neatly on the front, Ms. Eleanor Morgan. I hadn't seen my name printed that formally since my husband's funeral. Inside were legal documents. Cold. Precise. Ruthless. They stated, in immaculate language, that the property deed to my home had been transferred. That my signature had authorized it. That the house I had lived in for 40 years, where I had raised him, where I had buried his father's ashes beneath the old peach tree, no longer belonged to me. The signature was perfect. Perfectly forged. I sat on the kitchen floor for hours, the papers spread around me like snow, my heart hammering in my ears. I could smell the faint sweetness of rotting peaches from the broken branch outside. He had taken everything. And then, the next morning, the headline came. Jonathan Morgan to represent high-profile development firm in landmark property dispute case. The property was mine. And the lawyer representing them was him. My boy. My enemy. The son I had once rocked to sleep now stood on the other side of a battlefield I hadn't even realized I was on. And as I folded that newspaper with trembling hands, I knew there was only one path left to me. I would have to face him. Not as his mother. But as his opponent. The night I found out for certain, I sat at the kitchen table long after the kettle stopped hissing, staring at the deed papers spread like open wounds across the wood. The air in the house was so still, so heavy, it felt like it was pressing on my chest. It smelled faintly of old varnish and the lavender polish I'd always used on the floors, scents that had once comforted me but now only seemed to mock me. This house had been my sanctuary. It wasn't much by anyone else's standards. Just a squat, weathered home with peeling white paint and a front porch that sagged under its own age. But to me, it was the sum of everything I had survived. My husband had built it board by board when we were barely more than children ourselves, his hands rough and calloused but gentle when they cupped my face. Every nail in the walls was driven in with hope. Every room was lined with our laughter. And now, on those crisp legal sheets, my name was gone. Erased. Like I had never existed. I traced my finger over the signature at the bottom, the one that claimed to be mine. It was perfect, almost eerily so. But I knew my own handwriting like I knew my heartbeat, and this was not it. It was too smooth, too practiced, as if someone had copied me from memory and stripped out every tremor, every flaw. It was his hand. My son's. The realization made my stomach twist until I thought I might be sick. I pressed my palms flat against the cool table, trying to steady myself. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows, rattling them in their frames. The old peach tree groaned softly in the yard, its branches bare and brittle, reaching toward the dark like the fingers of a ghost. It hit me then that I was standing in the center of his crime scene. He hadn't just taken my house. He had taken our house. The place where I had soothed his fevers, marked his height on the doorframe, waited on the porch for him long past curfew, praying I would see his headlights. And he had stolen it like a stranger. I picked up the phone with shaking hands and dialed his number. It rang 3 times, then went to voicemail. His voice, smooth, distant, spilled into my ear. "You've reached Jonathan Morgan. Please leave a message." "Jonathan," I whispered, but my voice broke halfway through his name. I couldn't finish. I hung up. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at those papers. Hours maybe. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the edges of the curtains when I finally moved. I stood and walked slowly through each room like I was saying goodbye to something still alive. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of echoes. There was the kitchen, where he had once sat cross-legged on the counter while I taught him how to roll dough. He had gotten flour in his hair and laughed so hard he hiccuped. There was the living room, where he had danced clumsily with me after his high school graduation, holding my hands like he used to when he was small. There was the hallway where he had taken his first steps, tottering toward me with a look of sheer triumph. Every inch of this place was stitched with him. And yet he had erased me from it with the swipe of a pen. I couldn't stop wondering why. Had he done it to protect me, to manage things as he might have said in that clipped tone of his? Or had he done it because, to him, I no longer mattered? Did he think I wouldn't fight back? Maybe he thought I was too old, too tired. Maybe he assumed I would simply fade away, like a photograph left in the sun. The truth is, part of me almost did. For days after that, I drifted through the house like a ghost. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped opening the curtains. I ate little more than dry toast and tea. Neighbors came by, knocking softly, leaving casseroles on the porch, whispering to each other with pity etched on their faces. Did you hear? Her son took the house. Imagine raising a boy all alone just for him to do that. Poor thing. She must be heartbroken. They said it like I wasn't even human anymore, just a cautionary tale. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them they didn't know him, not really. That he had once wept when a bird hit our window and begged me to save it. That he used to kiss my cheek goodnight without me asking. That he used to belong to me, body and soul, before the world told him he could be more. But the words never came. Instead, I packed. I didn't have much left by then, just the remnants of a life. A few dresses. My husband's watch, long since stopped. The quilt my mother had sewn when I was born. A shoebox of old photographs, edges curled with time. I put them all carefully into cardboard boxes, labeling each one in neat block letters like I used to label his lunch bags. When I sealed the last box with tape, I sat on the floor and cried until my throat burned. It wasn't loud, messy crying. It was silent. The kind of crying that feels like drowning. That night, I slept on the bare mattress, surrounded by walls stripped of pictures, and dreamed of him as a boy again. In the dream, he was standing at the edge of the porch, looking back at me, smiling. He raised his hand like he was about to wave, then turned and walked into the dark. When I woke up, I knew I couldn't stay. Not because I wanted to leave, but because the house wasn't mine anymore. Not on paper, and not in spirit. It belonged to someone who saw it only as an asset, a plot of land, a legal claim. And if I stayed, I feared I would start to see it that way too. I left before dawn, when the streets were still asleep and the world was quiet. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't even leave a forwarding address. I simply loaded my boxes into the back of an old borrowed truck, took one last look at the house, and drove away. The sun rose behind me, painting the sky in bruised pinks and oranges. I didn't look back. But as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, something inside me cracked so sharply that I gasped. It felt like part of my ribcage had been ripped away, leaving my heart exposed to the cold. In the weeks that followed, I drifted from place to place, small rented rooms, friends' spare couches, even a church basement for a while. I told no one the truth. When people asked why I'd left my home, I smiled and said I needed a change of scenery. But at night, when the lights were off and I was alone with the hum of the radiator, I whispered the truth into the dark. My son stole my house. Saying it aloud made it real, and making it real made it unbearable. I had raised him to be strong, but I had not meant for him to become cruel. I had taught him to dream, not to devour. Some nights I hated him. Some nights I hated myself. But mostly, I just ached. I ached for the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street. I ached for the little voice that used to say, "I love you, Mama," as if it were as natural as breathing. I ached for the life we could have had if he had only remembered that love is worth more than power. And yet, even in my grief, a small ember of something else began to glow inside me. Anger. Not the wild, reckless kind. Quiet anger. Cold and clean, like the edge of a blade. It whispered that he might have taken my house, but he had not taken me. That I was still here. That I could fight. I didn't know how yet. I had no plan, no allies, no money. But I had one thing he didn't know I still possessed: time. I could wait. I could watch. I could bide my silence like a wolf in the snow, patient and unseen. And someday, when he least expected it, I would return. Not to beg, but to reclaim. The world believed I had disappeared. To them, I was a footnote, a frail woman who had lost everything, who had probably withered in some lonely hospice bed and faded into dust. It amused me, sometimes, to hear the rumors whispered in the little grocery shops when I slipped through town wrapped in a scarf and silence. They spoke of me as though I were buried already. But I wasn't gone. I was very much alive. After the betrayal, I took what little I had left, an old sewing machine, my mother's brooch, and the quiet steel in my bones, and moved 3 towns over. I found a tiny room above a cobbler's shop, the kind of place where the paint peeled like old scabs and the windows rattled in the wind. It smelled of leather and damp stone. I scrubbed the floor with my own hands the first night, just to make it mine. I worked for anyone who would let me. I mended clothes in the dim yellow light of my single lamp, stitching until my eyes throbbed. I cleaned houses for people who didn't bother learning my name. I washed dishes at a cafe before dawn, and in the evenings, I took in laundry from strangers who left bags by my door with no note, just cash tucked in the folds. It wasn't living. It was surviving. But survival, I learned, can be its own quiet form of defiance. Sometimes, when my hands cramped from hours of sewing, I'd pause and let my mind wander to him, my son. I wondered if he ever thought of me, if guilt ever pricked that polished heart of his. Then I would remember his eyes the last time I saw him. Cold, calculating, the way he couldn't even look at me as the notary handed him my house keys, and I'd shake the thought away like a dangerous spark. Years passed. My hair silvered, my back curved, and the lines around my mouth deepened like dry riverbeds. But the fire inside me didn't die. It only smoldered, waiting for breath. And then, one morning, I saw him again. It was by accident, or maybe fate, though I no longer trust that word. I was walking past the newsstand on my way to deliver mended curtains when his face stopped me in my tracks. There he was, my boy, smiling from the glossy cover of a business magazine. His name was printed in bold beneath the headline, "The Young Tycoon Who Built an Empire from Ashes." Ashes. My ashes. I stood there, trembling, the magazine crumpling in my hands as if it were flesh. He looked like his father in that photo, sharp jaw, proud stance, but the warmth that once danced in his eyes was gone. In its place was something colder, harder, greed wrapped in charm. From that day on, I began to watch. At first it was just curiosity, a need to know what had become of the boy I once rocked to sleep. But curiosity, when fed, becomes obsession. I read every article about him. I clipped his interviews, studied his words, his posture, his lies. I learned the names of his partners, his lawyers, his lovers. I watched the way he smiled when he spoke of legacy, as though legacy were not something you protect but something you seize with bloodied hands. I kept a journal. Every scandal, every lawsuit quietly settled, every whisper of corruption, I wrote it all down. Dates, names, amounts. My little sewing table became a map of his empire, pins and strings connecting secrets like a spider web. And oh, there were cracks. I saw them long before anyone else did. He had built everything too quickly, too hungrily, and greed is a weak foundation. Some of his partners were wolves, hungrier than he was, waiting for the right moment to turn on him. I saw their eyes in photographs. I recognized the look. I had seen it in his. Meanwhile, the world adored him. He threw lavish parties, bought mansions, appeared on television with his arm draped around women half his age. They called him brilliant. They called him unstoppable. They never called him mine. I stayed silent. I kept working, kept stitching hems and scrubbing floors, while I quietly collected the pieces of the truth. There were nights I cried into my pillow, my sobs muffled by the clatter of the trains passing below my window. I missed him, not the man he had become, but the boy who once ran barefoot through our garden chasing fireflies. Sometimes I hated myself for missing him at all. Love, I learned, doesn't die cleanly. It rots in your chest, turning sweet memories sour. Then came the day that changed everything. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that feels like punishment, when I overheard 2 men at the cafe whispering about him. They spoke of secret accounts, of a fraud investigation circling closer, of documents that could ruin him if they reached the wrong hands. My heart didn't leap. It simply steadied. Because in that moment, I knew what I had been waiting for. Not revenge, no, revenge is loud, and I had become quiet. What I wanted was something colder. I wanted him to see me again. Not as the soft mother he had discarded, not as the broken woman he had erased, but as the reckoning he never expected. I smiled into my cup of bitter coffee that night. My hands no longer trembled as they had when I first lost everything. They were steady, certain. I had waited in the shadows long enough. It was almost time to step back into the light. And this time, I wouldn't be alone. Because tucked inside my sewing box, beneath the scraps of silk and thread, lay the one thing that could shatter his empire in a single breath. A secret no one knew I still carried. And when he saw it, when he saw me, he would understand what it truly meant to lose everything. They thought I was nothing. A forgotten old woman who once lived on the edge of town and then simply disappeared. That was my greatest weapon. While their world spun with luxury cars and champagne glasses, mine spun quietly on the steady rhythm of my sewing machine. The world didn't see me anymore, which meant I could see everything. And I did. I saw the cracks, the shadows where truth hides when people are too busy looking at the glitter. I didn't rush. I had learned patience from years of hunger, years of grief. I moved like water, silent and unstoppable. The first thread I pulled was the notary, the man who had stood between my son and my house the day everything slipped from me. I remembered him clearly. His hands had trembled as he passed my boy those keys. He hadn't met my eyes, as though he knew something was wrong but lacked the spine to speak it. It took me months to find him. He had moved to a smaller city, retired early, and grown a belly that hung like guilt. I found him sitting on a bench near a duck pond, feeding crumbs to birds that didn't need him. I almost walked away. But then he looked up, and for the first time in years, someone recognized me. God. I thought you were dead, he whispered. I was, I said softly, and sat beside him. We didn't talk about the weather or the ducks or the way age had crept up on us. We talked about that day. About the document he had notarized. I asked him how a boy could transfer property that was never truly his, and how my signature, shaky, precise, forged, ended up on that deed. His eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Shame, maybe. Or fear of a ghost come back to haunt him. I owed your husband, he muttered at last. He saved my business once, gave me money when the bank wouldn't. And your son, he said he needed it. He said you wanted him to have it before you. Before I died, I finished for him. He nodded, staring down at his crumbs. I let the silence stretch until he squirmed. Then I laid a trembling hand on his, the way I used to when my boy lied to me as a child. You'll tell the truth now, I said. Not a question. A statement. And he did. He wrote everything down. The falsified signature, the coercion, the way my son had waved legal jargon like a weapon. The man signed it and pressed his old notary seal to the paper as if it burned him. I folded the confession and slid it into my handbag like a jewel. One piece of armor. Next, I hunted ghosts of my own life. I visited the old schoolteacher who once called my boy a gentle soul, when he stayed after class to help clean chalk dust. She lived in a care home now, her hair thin as moth wings. I brought her tea and held her hand as she wept at the memory of him. He was so kind, she said. So small. Always hungry, but never complained. I asked her to write it down. Not the kindness, though that mattered to my heart, but the fact that he had grown up poor, raised solely by me, that everything he became was built on my shoulders. She wrote it slowly, her knuckles swollen, and signed her name with shaky pride. More pieces. I sought out the mason who had laid the first bricks of our house with my husband. He was older now, bent like the arches he once built, but his voice carried the weight of truth. He remembered how my husband built that house with his own hands, how we lived on bread and beans to pay for each stone. He remembered me mixing mortar barefoot in the dust, my son toddling in the yard while I worked. He testified, too, in writing, that the land had always been meant for me. For us. Piece by piece, I stitched a tapestry of what they tried to erase. At night, I spread the documents across my table, running my fingers over them like Braille. Confessions, letters, testimonies, threads of my past, woven into something sharp enough to cut through lies. And still, I needed more. So I watched his company closer. Through whispers in cafes, through discarded memos I bribed janitors to slip me, through the trembling voice of a young assistant who admitted, anonymously, that my son had hidden funds in offshore accounts under false names. I followed trails of numbers like breadcrumbs, mapping them in my worn ledger. I didn't fully understand the codes and balances, but I didn't have to. I only had to prove they existed. And I did. I hired a young lawyer then, quietly, discreetly, a woman fresh from law school, fiery-eyed, who believed in justice the way I once believed in love. I told her everything, placed my entire heart on her cluttered desk, and said, I don't want his money. I want my name back. She didn't laugh. She didn't look at me like I was fragile. She simply said, we'll get it. For the first time in years, I believed someone. We worked in silence, like thieves. She filed requests, gathered records, made copies of every piece of my puzzle, and tucked them away where he couldn't reach. We built a fortress from paper and pain. No one suspected. No one knew. While the world toasted his empire, I sharpened the truth like a blade. There were nights I almost faltered, when exhaustion wrapped around me like a shroud and I wondered if it was worth it, if dignity mattered when no one cared to remember my name. But then I'd see his smile on television, that hollow charm, and I would remember the day he stood before me, cold and distant, and signed my life away with my stolen name. Yes. It was worth it. By the time I was done, my sewing table had transformed into a war room. Documents stacked in precise towers, timelines drawn in red ink, names underlined twice. The old photograph of my husband smiled faintly from the corner, as if he knew. As if he had been waiting too. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a ghost anymore. I saw a woman reborn from ashes. They thought I was gone. But I was coming back. And when I walked into that courtroom, they would finally understand what silence had been hiding all along. The morning of the hearing was strangely quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the usual barking of the neighbor's dog. The world felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting to see if I would collapse under the weight of what I was about to do, or rise from it. I rose. I buttoned my oldest black dress, the one my husband had always said made me look like I carried storms in my eyes. My hands trembled as I smoothed it down, but not from fear, no, this was something sharper. Resolve. The kind of strength that grows in the dark, watered by years of silence. I walked to the courthouse alone. No one offered me an arm. No one knew who I was. And that suited me just fine. The building loomed ahead, stone and glass and history, as if it too had watched generations rise and fall. My heels clicked against the steps like a countdown. My breath fogged in the cold air, but inside, I burned. They were already there when I entered. My son stood near the front, tall and polished in his charcoal suit, a perfect portrait of control. His hair was cut short now, his jaw sharp, his face unreadable. Only his hands betrayed him, restless, always moving, adjusting his cufflinks, smoothing his tie. He didn't see me at first. No one did. The room buzzed with low conversation, with the shuffling of papers and the metallic clatter of briefcases. But as I took my first step inside, the sound began to falter. Conversations hiccuped. Heads turned. Brows furrowed. I knew what they saw, an old woman with hollow cheeks, clutching a cracked leather handbag like it held the last of her soul. And maybe it did. Someone snickered. Another whispered, "Who let her in here?" Their laughter was soft but slicing, like a paper cut. It didn't wound me. It fueled me. I walked, steady as a tide, until I reached the plaintiff's table. I didn't sit. I stood there, letting them see me fully. Letting my silence stretch, taut as a bowstring. Then my son finally looked up. The moment his eyes met mine, time cracked open. I saw him at 5 years old, running barefoot through the garden. At 12, crying silently when his father's casket closed. At 17, clutching his scholarship letter with trembling hands. And then I saw what he was now, stone where flesh once was, ice where warmth used to live. He didn't flinch. Not yet. "Good morning," he said coolly, as if to a stranger. I smiled. "Good morning, son." The word landed like a stone dropped in still water. The room rippled with it. He froze. Just for a breath. But I saw it, the tiniest fracture in his armor. His lips pressed thin, his eyes flicked away. A muscle jumped in his jaw. I sat then, easing into my chair as though I were lowering myself onto a throne. The judge entered. Papers rustled. Voices settled into obedience. And then, it began. My lawyer spoke first. Her voice was steady but laced with fire. She presented the deed, the fraudulent signature, the confession from the notary who had once betrayed me. Gasps fluttered through the room when his statement was read aloud, the old seal pressed beside his trembling name. My son tried to object, his voice sharp, almost desperate. But the judge silenced him with a glance. Then came the letters, the testimonies from the schoolteacher, the mason, the neighbors who had watched me raise him with hands that bled from work. Photos of our house as it once was, cracked walls, wildflowers sprouting through the garden fence, sunlight spilling over laundry lines. Every piece was a shard of my life, and together they formed something undeniable. And then I stood. "I did not come here to destroy my son," I began, my voice soft enough to make them lean in. "I came here because he destroyed me, and forgot I was still alive." I turned to him. His face was pale now, his hands still. "You were my whole world," I said. "Everything I built for you. But you," my voice broke, then steadied like a wave. "You built your world on my bones." Silence filled the courtroom. Not the ordinary hush of formality, no, this was a silence that trembled, a silence that ached. "I don't want his fortune," I said. "I want my name. My home. My place in the story he rewrote without me." The judge watched me for a long moment. So did my son. His eyes flickered with something raw, anger, maybe. Or fear. Or the ghost of the boy he used to be. We laid down the final piece then, the trail of forged accounts, the secret funds hidden under names that weren't his. The paper trail was clean, cold, and merciless. My son's lawyer blanched. He turned on him in a furious whisper. My son didn't answer. He was staring at me. For the first time in years, he saw me. Not as an obstacle. Not as an echo. As the woman who had carried him through fire, and now stood in his way. The judge called for a recess. Chairs scraped, voices rose again, but none of it touched me. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my breath deep and even. Because I knew. In the space between the gavel and the verdict. The story of who we were was already breaking apart. And when the pieces fell, one of us would be gone. The gavel struck like the crack of an old tree limb, sharp and final, echoing through the hushed courtroom. For a moment, time seemed to stop, even the dust motes hung still in the sunlight slanting through the high windows. I sat there, hands folded tightly in my lap, watching as the judge's words dissolved into the silence like drops of ink in water. "The property in question," he declared, his voice even but firm, "shall be returned to its rightful owner, Mrs. Farah Noor." Returned. That word struck me harder than any insult, sharper than any betrayal. Returned, as if what had been stolen could simply be handed back, as if all the years spent in shadows could be packed into neat files and sealed with a stamp. My lawyer touched my elbow gently, whispering something about signatures and follow-up paperwork, but his words floated past me, hollow and meaningless. All I could hear was the silence, thick, heavy, suffocating, as it wrapped around the room like fog. I dared to glance at my son. He was sitting perfectly still, his jaw tight, the color drained from his face. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. He just looked, emptied. Like someone had pulled the strings that kept him upright and left behind only the shell. His eyes, those same eyes that had once searched for me in crowded schoolyards and scanned the horizon for my wave, were fixed on the table, refusing to rise to meet mine. I had imagined this moment so many times, in the lonely nights when I lay awake on a thin mattress, the sound of distant trains echoing through my rented room. I imagined him leaping up in outrage, calling me a liar, trying to crush me with his lawyers and his wealth. I imagined him sneering, mocking the woman he thought he'd buried with his ambition. But this silence, this quiet defeat, it was worse. Because it reminded me of the boy he used to be when he was ashamed, when he had lied about breaking the neighbor's window and hidden behind me, trembling, when he had gotten a failing grade and cried into my shawl, begging me not to be disappointed. That same boy seemed to flicker behind the polished man he had become, like a ghost trapped in the body of a stranger. And for the briefest second, my heart ached for him. The others, his wife, her parents, sat frozen. No more jeweled laughter. No more smug smiles. They looked at me like they were seeing a ghost, and maybe they were. I had returned from the dead they had imagined for me. But instead of triumph, I felt only a hollowness yawning wide inside me, swallowing all the vindication I thought would be here. I rose slowly, my knees protesting, my hands trembling though I tried to still them. The wooden bench creaked. No one moved. Even the bailiff watched me as though afraid to breathe. When I reached for my cane, it slipped for a moment, and he flinched. My son actually flinched, as though the faint clatter had struck him. My gaze caught his, and for the first time in years, our eyes met. And just like that, it was no longer the courtroom around us. It was the kitchen of our old house, with sunlight on the cracked linoleum and the smell of cardamom tea in the air. He was 5 years old, holding my finger with sticky jam-covered hands, looking up at me with that quiet trust that only children know. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but the words withered on my tongue. What was there left to say? That I forgave him? That I understood? That none of this brought me joy? That I would have given up every coin, every acre, every paper with my name on it, just to have the boy he once was back for one more morning? But the distance between us was too vast now. Years of silence had hardened like stone between us. So I simply nodded, once, and turned away. The sound of my steps echoed in the hollow space as I walked out of the courtroom. No one followed. No one called after me. Outside, the sun was too bright, stabbing at my eyes after the dim, dusty light of the courtroom. I paused on the courthouse steps, gripping the cold railing, and let the wind brush against my face. The city moved on around me, buses groaning past, vendors calling out their wares, children laughing in bursts like popping bubbles. And I felt utterly alone. In my hand was the court's decree, folded neatly, its edges cutting into my palm. I had won. The house, the land, the legacy, all of it was mine again. The world would see this as justice, as victory. But what use is a crown when there is no one left to place it on your head with pride? What good is a home when its rooms echo only with the footsteps of ghosts? I had walked into that courtroom with fire in my heart, but I walked out carrying only ashes. I thought, for one foolish heartbeat, that he might come after me. That he might run down the steps like he used to when I picked him up from school, calling out, "Mama," with his arms open. That he might collapse against me, sobbing, begging for another chance. That he might let me hold him one last time, not as an enemy or a threat, but as his mother. But the courthouse doors stayed closed behind me. I stood there until the shadow of the building stretched long across the pavement, until the afternoon light turned soft and golden. Then, without looking back, I walked away. My shoes tapped against the stones, slow and steady. I did not go to claim the house that had been restored to my name. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because I knew now that some victories come not with applause or embraces, but with silence, and a heart that feels heavier than defeat ever did. And as I disappeared into the winding streets, blending into the faceless crowd, I realized something else, something sharp and cold and unbearably true. I had won back everything, except the one thing I had truly wanted all along, my son. If my story has stirred something in your heart, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Share this story with someone who might be walking through their own quiet battles, someone who needs to be reminded that strength can live inside the softest voices. Leave a comment and tell me what part touched you most. I read every word. And if you believe in stories that reveal the hidden truths behind broken smiles, subscribe for more. Together, we'll keep these echoes of resilience alive, so no one ever feels invisible in their fight again.